Good morning, lovelies. Today I am sharing 10 of the worst world building tips I have ever heard or seen executed on the page. Specifically, we are talking about world building for fantasy and science fiction stories. World building for the sake of world building or for RPGs, that's a different arena entirely. Look, I'm a fantasy and science fiction author. That's what this channel is about. Hey guys, I just wanted to let you know that I now have a WORLDBUILDER'S checklist available for when you are ready to figure out all those little world building details for your story. It's called the Ultimate WORLDBUILDER'S Checklist. It is available on my website for 99 cents. Unless you are a patron on my Patreon page, then you get it for free. I will link both of those things in the description of this video, so go check it out. Alright, back to the video. So without further ado, here are the bad tips. Please, please, please do not follow them. Number 1, just copy and paste from real world history. Everyone is so obsessed with realism these days. So choose a favorite time period in history and don't make any changes except for the names. Then add magic and you're good. Look, if I wanted a story set in ancient China or medieval Europe, plus or minus some magic, I would look in the historical fiction section, not fantasy. Yes, you should absolutely research real-world history in order to better understand how human civilizations rise, fall, and work. And yes, you can absolutely pull inspiration from those civilizations when it comes to building your own cultures. But readers are going to notice if you copy and paste from real-world history. The Poppy War, an otherwise stellar novel, is supposed to be an epic fantasy inspired by Imperial China, but one of the scenes is an exact recreation of the Rape of Nanjing, word for word. You can pull it up side by side with a history book if you want to. And it shouldn't be like that in a fantasy novel. We don't want to read about real life. We want to read about a fantasy world that does not exist. It's something new that we've never seen before. Yeah, sure, it can parallel certain events, like how Game of Thrones parallels the War of the Roses. But while we can identify the seeds of that real-world inspiration, nobody can deny that it is definitely its own thing. Number 2, just use medieval Europe for your fantasy base. I mean, specifically Northwest Europe. No other time period or geographical setting matters. To be fair, this one is going out of style. Thank fuck. Most readers are so sick and tired of seeing the same old setting that is so clearly modeled after medieval Europe and doesn't bother to change much. If you love Europe and want to use it as your base, I implore you to use a different time period, like when the Roman Empire was cutting its way as far as Britain before collapsing, or during the French Revolution era, or steampunk it. If you are just fascinated by medieval Europe specifically and the classic fantasy setting that draws from it, then I encourage you to put a new spin on it. Play with the gender roles and sexualities. Smash it with another element that we're not used to seeing in that type of setting, like dinosaurs or zombies. Give us a different point of view, like the main character is a hunting dog or that chivalrous knight's horse. Using old tropes, techniques, and settings is fine, but you gotta give us something new. Number 3, it must be historically accurate from our world. That means if you are using medieval Europe as a model, then every single major character in your story must be white, and it must be horribly patriarchal and sexist because that's accurate. Except for the rotting teeth and the lack of shaving. I mean, you can hand wave that. I say this as someone who has a bachelor's degree in history. You do not need to be historically accurate at all. We're not reading a history textbook or even historical fiction. It's fantasy. It takes place in a world that does not exist, with rules, history, and culture that you made up. Even if you are pulling inspiration from a real world setting, that does not dictate every world building decision that you have to make. You can have powerful women and a bunch of people of color and queer characters and disabled characters and characters with 4 arms and 2 heads and snake tails on every page, and it can make perfect sense in your world because it's your world and you make the rules. Also, history, including Europe's, is a lot more diverse than people think, so the historically accurate argument doesn't even hold up. Number 4, you need to know about every single detail of your world, even the ones that don't ever appear in your story, such as the creation of the world, which gods were involved, the entire culture and lineages of countries that your characters aren't even going to step foot in. Nope. You only need to know the details of your world that are prevalent to your story. If the creation of the world does not matter to the story or your characters, you don't need to include it or even know it. If there are 90 countries in your world, but your characters only visit 3 of them, you only need to know the details of those 3 countries and broad strokes of any others that they encounter or hear of. If this becomes a series and they eventually end up going to more of these countries, then it might help to have a general idea of what some of these other countries are like. Write it down in a journal or a document so you can reference it later and build off of it. But again, you do not need to know these details until it comes time to actually write about it. Speaking of which, number 5, you should know everything about your world before you ever begin outlining it. Never mind writing it. Look, I say this as the biggest, most thorough planner that I know. You do not need to know every single detail about your world before you begin writing your novel. This is where we get into planner versus pantser territory. Planners, people who tend to outline their novels, do tend to create most of the world before writing it, which makes sense. We want some sort of plan before we begin. Pantsers, people who do not outline because they're flying by the seat of their pants, figure it out as they go along. These folks tend to feel trapped and confined by their outlines. Both are valid, and a part of being a writer is figuring out where you fall on this spectrum. Personally, I plan the outline and the world at roughly the same time, as the two tend to influence each other. I spend about a week or 2 figuring out the broad strokes of the world and any significant details that are pertinent to the plot and characters. In the case of Citadel, my sci-fi novel that comes out next year, this was primarily things like government and military structure, technology or the lack thereof, the geography, flora and fauna, and gender roles, both of the human town of Citadel and the aliens that they encounter. Because those are all of the most important elements of the story and have a direct impact on the characters and plot. And because I am a planner, I had to know what those elements were, at least broadly speaking, before I started writing. But after that's done, after I just have those broad strokes, then I start writing, and then I fill any world building gaps I find along the way. Most of these new world building elements do end up in my book because I come across those gaps when the characters do. But other elements that I come up with on my own and aren't important to the story, I put in my binder or a Word document so I can reference it later if it becomes important. This allows me to go into the story prepared, but I'm also not wasting months or years of fiddling with details that ultimately don't even really matter. I figure out what I need to start, and then once I've got a rough outline of what everything looks like, that's good enough, time to start writing. I have never spent more than a month focusing on just world building. And that was because I had a dozen other things going on that took up my time. Number 6, you've spent so much time building this world, you deserve to include every single detail in the story. No, you don't. Unless you are explicitly writing some sort of atlas or bestiary. We're here for a story. We want to see the characters do stuff, not just, sit around and discuss the history and culture of various countries that don't exist. Again, only include the details that are prevalent to the story. If a character walks into a room and sits on the couch, a rich description of how soft and fluffy it is, that would be nice. And maybe the fact that it was imported from another country across the sea, that would show that the couch's owner is pretty wealthy. But we probably don't need the exact procedure for the making, stuffing, and transporting of this couch. We just need to know what it looks like, what it feels like, and that it is expensive. That's it. Number 7, if you're going to have a magic system, then you don't have to make any rules. It's magic. You don't have to follow any type of structure. Technically, no. But mostly, yes, you do. I've done a couple of videos on magic systems, which I will link in the cards, but basically, magic systems exist on a spectrum between hard and soft. Hard magic systems have strict, rigid rules with little to no wiggle room. They're almost like science. You know exactly what you have to do to get this exact result. Soft magic systems do not have that rigidity, which means the magic is usually more mysterious, whimsical, and or dangerous. So if you're writing a soft magic system, then yeah, you're right. You probably don't need much structure, especially if your POV character is not a magic user. So long as it doesn't feel like a deus ex machina and or there is a clear reason why the magic is not working when it should be, then you're fine. Hard magic systems are a different beast entirely. The whole point is the structure. The readers need to clearly know what the rules are, what is needed to make the magic work, what is the expected outcome of the magic. Is there a cost or limit? Again, you do not have to go overboard or give a 20-page lecture on the subject, just the minimum details needed to give context for the rest of the story. Now, it could be fun to have a magic be relatively new and unknown, at least to the POV character, so they're left fumbling and trying to figure out the rules of this magic system. You would still have to come up with the rules and structure as needed, but you're not revealing it right away. Your readers only learn how the magic works when the character does. I mean, that could be a really cool premise because we see all these books and stories where magic is a long established practice, is pretty much entirely figured out, maybe a new innovation or two. Having a story where the entire premise of magic is new and the characters have to figure out what the rules are on their own, that'd be kind of cool. I did read a series sort of like that, but it was fantasy romance and too much time was spent on the love interest dick, so I never finished it. Number 8, make sure to tell your reader everything important about your world and not show them such information through intense scenes or snarky dialogue. Long pages of exposition are the only ways that they'll learn and remember the information. I see this one all the time in manuscripts that I professionally critique. Y'all need to learn show, don't tell. Sometimes, yes, we do need a character or the narrator to plainly state, this is how this part of the world works. But most of the time, it can and should be shown over the course of an entire scene or chapter. So for example, let's say you have a monster fight in chapter 12 and you have to communicate to the reader the monster's strengths and weaknesses. The obvious show don't tell would be to show us the monster smashing buildings and spitting acid that dissolves street signs, and then the character scrambling to figure out what the weakness is. You don't have to say the monster has the strength of 5 tanks and can spit really strong acid. No, show us. But let's say that you want to give us some exposition on the monster before chapter 12, maybe a little bit of foreshadowing. How do you do that in a way that keeps the reader engaged? Exposition is hard, and in this case, we can't really show the reader what the information without the monster present. I mean, I guess you could show us the monster in its cage trying to get out and spitting acid and whatnot, but if that's not an option, then I would say, give the characters something else to focus on, some other important aspect of the plot, and then write the scene around that. So, you're doing a young adult fantasy story. So let's say the main characters are sitting in a monster class listening to the teacher drone on about this monster. The characters kind of tuning them out and instead they focus on their crush a few seats over. You're writing a romance or at least a romantic subplot. Instead of taking notes on the monster, your character is now writing a love note or a will you go to prom with me note and is spending the time working up the courage to pass it along, and maybe they have a rival between them and is refusing to pass it. They kind of got to bargain with them, but we're still getting that important monster information because you're slipping in the teacher's lecture every now and then. The main character might be tuning it out, and your reader is going to be far more focused on what your main character is emotionally invested in, but the reader's also going to absorb that monster information and at least vaguely recall the lecture on it when chapter 12 comes along, when your main character is kicking themselves for not paying attention in class. Number 9, you don't need to add any type of descriptions about your world, setting, or characters, just the bare bones will do. And no need to repeat a handful of key descriptions to remind the reader what everything looks like every now and then. They'll remember even after hundreds of pages. No, they won't. I'll admit it, I struggle with this one big time. When I'm doing revisions and self-edits, I have to dedicate an entire read-through just to look for places to add more descriptions, because otherwise none of my readers know what anything looks like or where anything is, ever. We need descriptions of your world and characters to know what they look like and what's going on. And we need a few key details of each character and setting repeated every time we visit them. So if the story takes place on an alien planet, tell us about the 3 moons in the sky, and then reiterate those 3 moons every time night falls. Maybe the main character tracks their different phases, and that helps the reader know how much time has passed. Or the sunsets and sunrises will paint the moons a specific color that is thematically or symbolically appropriate to whatever's going on in your book. When we first meet, say, the mentor character, give us the full description of her graying hair in a bun, the leather jacket over the knee-length dress, and the fraying sandals. And then choose one or two of those details to repeat every time we meet her again. She'll put on or readjust her leather jacket every time we see her. Or brush the gray strands that fall out of her bun in every scene she's in. Or her arrival or departure will be heralded by the flip-flop of her sandals every time. Bonus points if you can pair a physical description with an emotion, like a nervous tick or a warning that they're getting angry. Emotions really seal in memory. So one character tugs on her long blonde braid whenever she's nervous or embarrassed. Another takes off his silver glasses and puts them in a blue case right before he starts a fight or an argument. Or they'll drop their long red painted nails whenever they're really excited about something or thinking about something. Remind your reader about these things every time. It'll feel repetitive to write it so often, but if it doesn't, then you haven't included it enough. And number 10, you'll know you succeeded in world building when your book requires a reference guide. Your readers should be flipping back to that for character lineages, geography, world history, even language, every chapter. Why bother seamlessly weaving that information into the story itself when you can just assign them homework? Look, this is a personal pet peeve of mine. I will not pick up a book that has a language glossary. This is when the writer has come up with so many words in their fantasy language and have chosen to include those words in the book itself with little to no translation that they've had to create an entire glossary so the readers don't get lost. I hate it! Now, that is a personal pet peeve of mine. Some people are okay with that. But for the most part, you should be able to use exposition or show don't tell to communicate what's going on in your world and not have them flip back and forth between story and glossary for the proper context. If you're doing a whole new fantasy language, I would not expect your reader to remember more than one or two phrases. Maximum. Even the most die-hard Game of Thrones fans can't recall much Dothraki, but we all know what Valar Morghulis and Valar Dohaeris mean. That's because those two phrases are repeated multiple times in the story and they have relatively simple translations. All men must die, all men must serve. If you want to include dialogue of that new language in the story itself, fine. But translate it in the story itself. Maybe the main character only knows a few words and phrases, so when another character speaks, we're getting a hodgepodge of English and fantasy language that the main character is trying and failing to translate, and that can drive the conflict of the scene. Or maybe the main character is fluent, but one friend only knows English, and the other only knows this fantasy language, so the main character is stuck playing translator back and forth between them. It would be hilarious if those two who could not communicate directly just really do not like each other, but the translator friend wants them to get along, so they're translating it in much more politely and filtering out the swears than that'd be fun. Point being, we're not here to learn a new language. We're here to read a story, and that is going to be greatly hindered if we have to learn a language to understand it. Write a separate book all about this fantasy language if you really want to, like a mockumentary or bonus content on Patreon. Your diehard fans would love it. If you want good world building advice, check out this playlist here. If you want more bad advice, this playlist here. I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies.